Minehead's Turntable, narrated by Andy Forster. From its beginnings, the Minehead branch always had a turntable at its terminus, firstly at Watchet and later at Minehead. Design details for the first turntable at Minehead are limited. Its location was at the station building end of the south side of the small platform, close to the present gents' toilets. Size was probably around 35 foot in diameter, suitable for the broad gauge tank engines then in use. Around 1900, the GWR purchased the Minehead Railway Company. It then invested in a larger turntable of 45 foot diameter, which was located beside the locomotive shed. This new turntable was of the deep pit undergirder type. Whilst this was satisfactory for tank locomotives, when larger 4300 class moguls and Bird class 440s started to be used, the turntable needed to be modified with extension ramp rails that overhung one end. It was on to these ramps that the tender was run up in order to fit the locomotive on. This made the hand-crank turntable harder to operate, both due to the greater weight and being out of balance. It was the length of this turntable that restricted the use of larger locomotives on the Minehead branch, such as 2800 and Manor classes. In the late 1930s, a proposal was made to install a 65 foot diameter turntable that could turn any GWR class locomotive, and an outline drawing was prepared. Perhaps because of the threat of war or other reasons, this installation never took place. The 45 foot table with its ramps continued to be used until the end of steam. Following the closure of the Minehead branch by BR in 1971, the present WSR company made plans for reopening a privately owned railway. Steam haulage evidently formed at least part of these plans, as the company's first purchase was a quantity of redundant GWR water columns and water tanks from Pwllheli in North Wales. In addition, it purchased the redundant 55 foot diameter turntable from the same location. This turntable initially remained in situ, but was moved by road to Minehead in early 1978. It resided at several locations in Minehead Yard over the years, eventually ending up in the short spur by Minehead signal box, resting on two old carriage bogies. Over the years, the GWR adopted several designs of turntable in varying lengths. Some were made at Swindon and some purchased from outside contractors. Turntables generally are of two basic designs, undergirder or overgirder, and of two basic principles, end supported or balanced. Undergirder turntables are lighter and simpler to manufacture, as they have the main structural girders directly under the rails, but they require a deep pit for the girders to rotate in. Deep pits require protection of some sort to stop staff falling in, especially in dark, smoke-filled roundhouses. Deep pits are also harder to get the locomotive out of when somebody makes a mistake and drives their locomotive onto a turntable that just isn't there. Overgirder turntables have the main girders above the rails on each side of the locomotive. This makes them more expensive and heavier due to the required cross-bracing to support the track, but they only require a shallow pit of about 12 inches deep. This makes them easier to get a locomotive out of and not so dangerous to fall into. End-supported turntables take the weight at each end on rollers. Balanced turntables take nearly all of the weight on the centre pivot. End-supported turntables have to be powered or move round by means of a hand crank mechanism. Balanced turntables are easier to move and can either be powered or pushed by hand. On a balanced turntable, the locomotive must be stopped in the right place so that the turntable is like a level seesaw. In the late 1890s, Dean designed a new 55-foot overgirder turntable called the St Blaise type. An early example was installed at Swindon Works beside A Shop. Many more were installed at other locations, including Pwllheli. As locomotives increased in length, 55 foot was no longer big enough, so the Swindon turntable was modified to 65 foot long by adding 5 foot at each end. Many others were similarly modified, but not Pwllheli. The St Blaise type is noticeable by the smooth, curved top face of the main girders from one end to the other. Back to Minehead. Over the years, the old turntable continued to deteriorate. It was never good. Ideas came and went, and included suggestions as to where it might be located. Minehead itself was the only sensible place, but by now the site had become congested and adjacent land mostly built upon. The future seemed bleak, and many people wanted to cut it up. Around the year 2000, the local district council was considering moving its main offices from Willerton to newly built premises at Minehead, on undeveloped county council-owned land to the south of the station. The local communities of Willerton and Minehead opposed this move, and after much public protest, prevented the building taking place. Consequently, Somerset County Council had a large area of land to develop, and some £6 million of European funding, without a plan of what to build. Following a period of community consultation and presentations by various stakeholders, a design evolved which included extensive car and coach parking, industrial units, a youth centre, a covered area for a street market, a small visitor centre, and a railway turntable. Eventually in 2007, the railway was given the responsibility of turning 50 tons of rusty steel into a working turntable. The grant funding was time limited, and the turntable needed to be ready in 6 months. Installation had to be complete in advance of other building work around the site. The WSR had wisely purchased a very full set of drawings for the turntable from BR at Swindon in 1972, which was still on file. Also, all the drawings for the extension to 65 foot were available from either the National Railway Museum or Wiltshire County Records Office. Armed with these, it was possible to rebuild to the larger 65 foot size. Fortunately, a contractor in the Midlands agreed to take on the task of refurbishment on the tight timescale. Minehead workshops arranged for the refurbishment of the end roller and bearing assemblies, centre bearing, and other smaller parts. Today, apart from the main girders, centre pivot box, and various fittings, most of the turntable below rail level is new. Sundry fittings such as handrails, curb castings, maintenance pit covers, etc., had all been stored and were refurbished for reuse. Other parts were remade new, such as the hardened and highly polished centre main bearing pin, which sits in a phosphor bronze cup. This pin supports the entire weight of turntable and locomotive, up to 200 tons on a rotating contact area of just 2.5 inches diameter. Following construction of the foundations and pit, one foggy Sunday morning in February 2008, the turntable made its final leg of the move off the M5 at Taunton towards Minehead. At 65 feet long and 16 feet wide, this involved a staged road closure of the entire A358 and A39 for the length of the 25-mile journey, watched by thousands of people as it passed each village. At Washford, the buildings are only 16 foot 4 inches apart, 2 inches each side clearance. The following day, a crane of 600 tons capacity lifted the complete turntable into the pit. To the great relief of all, it fitted. Several months later, the adjoining trackwork, walkways, walls and fences were completed. On 24th of June 2008, 4160 became the first locomotive onto the turntable. The two turntables at Minehead and Swindon are now the only GWR St Blaise type example in use. To turn a locomotive or any other vehicle, the locomotive has to stop at the approach to the turntable. The fireman dismounts and checks that the two locking bolts are engaged and locked. These are the long handles at each end. They operate locking bolts to prevent the turntable rotating. The bolts also support the end of the turntable so that the unbalanced weight of the locomotive, as it rolls on, does not rest on the small corner guide rollers. The fireman now calls the driver slowly forward and watches carefully. As the locomotive approaches the point of balance, the turntable tips a couple of inches. Sometimes the driver does not stop quickly enough, and the locomotive has to be moved back a bit. The driver must now close the regulator, apply the brakes, screw down the handbrake, open drain cocks, and put the reverser in mid-gear to prevent the locomotive moving. Driver and fireman now each unlock a bolt by pulling a handle down and begin pushing. They cannot see each other, so to avoid embarrassment, it is customary for both to push clockwise. The lever is always pushed, never pulled. This is for safety. In the event of someone falling, the bar will move away from the person, not towards them. There is very little friction, but an awful lot of inertia in moving the turntable. All the energy put into getting the turntable moving must be put in again to slowing it down half a turn later. After aligning the rails, both bolts are re-engaged and the locomotive slowly moved off the turntable, the operation only taking a few minutes. Whenever the Minehead turntable is used, there is an audience watching the spectacle. There must be tens of thousands of home video recordings of it around the world. The end.